Ursa is fundamentally a character defined less by who she is and more by what happens to her. I do not mean that in a negative sense necessarily. She is simply a character who has difficulty exerting agency and action, and as a result, it is rather difficult in the show of Avatar: The Last Airbender to be clear as to who she actually is, other than a very sweet person, Zuko's beloved mother. And to an extent, he probably idealizes or sentimentalizes her. Understandable, considering we see her only in flashbacks, where Zuko is much younger, and she was the only halfway decent person, other than Iroh, to him in his childhood. But nonetheless, the show itself does not necessarily provide as clear an idea of who she actually is and what her relationship with Ozai was like, other than the fact that it's bad. Thankfully, we get a lot more information about her in The Search, and there is now enough to piece together a basic picture of her relationship with Ozai. Ozai is honestly not one of the more interesting characters in Avatar: The Last Airbender. He is interesting for what he means to Zuko. For Zuko, he is the voice of stern parental authority. He is the benchmark of honor and worthwhile status in this country. He wants to be accepted by his father. He wants to be admired and valued by his father. And his desire for that individual parental validation is innately tied for Zuko, since Ozai is the ruler of the Fire Nation, to his idea of what honor means in the Fire Nation, to his idea of what it means to be a good and reasonable and patriotic and just person in the society. And it is a concept that fundamentally goes against his innate, inborn sense of what he believes to be right and meaningful and reasonable. And so this conflict overwhelms Zuko. After the death of his mother, in his mind, she's not really dead, but he believes she is. He is left alone with his father and his commitment to the ideals of his father, and he measures his worth by his commitment to those ideals, and he is so trapped within that prism of mind, evaluation, that the fact that his father banishes him and burns his face only deepens his resolve to gain the respect and the appreciation of his father. Nonetheless, Ozai himself is not a particularly complex or nuanced character, and looking into his relationship with Ursa does not do a lot to broaden one's conception of her and his relationship in accordance with her. He did not really want her to be a person because he did not like her as a person. He simply valued her as the heir to Avatar Roku. And so by marrying her, he increases his power and his status. He does not really think much of her as a person other than as an accessory. She is valuable to him only so far as she does what he wants her to do. Ursa is someone who does not really have a choice in this affair. She is brought to the palace more or less against her will, and her actual romance that she had back home is severed. Ozai is a fundamentally controlling person, and it is exactly that emphasis on control above all else that prevents him from being fully satisfied or satiated. This is the classic Hegelian master and slave dialectic. The person with the power ultimately defined themselves through that power and their exercise of it over the person who actually does things, who's actually has a sense of being in the world, who's actually interacting with their environment. The master, quote unquote, the powerful person in this relationship can only gain satisfaction through domination. And it is a fundamentally shadow sense of satisfaction that provides no sense of self-knowledge and no potential for growth or even a greater understanding of the world. And the more they humiliate the person beneath them, the more they degrade that person, the less that person really is identifiable as a person, as an independent subject, which leads to the fundamental dissatisfaction and malaise of the person in power. The person on the other side of the dynamic, conversely, though they suffer greatly, has at least a strong connection to their actual experience in the world. They know how they suffer. They know what they want. They have a direct connection through their being in the world of what the world actually is. They have a firmer picture in their mind of what the world actually is and how they relate to it. And so even though their body is crushed and their spirit is to an extent crushed, they nonetheless retain a cognizance of the world that is actually denied to the person in power who merely defines themselves by subjugating others. The individual subjectivity is not fully crushed by the ruthlessness of the way of the world, but instead through that interaction between the individual subjectivity and one's own perception of the cruelty of the way of the world, one develops the capacity for a greater understanding of oneself and of the world around one. This is very Hegelian, and it should be cited in its proper Hegelian context. But it also is relevant in the sense that the powerful in this dynamic innately trap themselves in this prism of ignorance, and one-sidedness, and that is fundamentally true of Ozai. He remains this shriveled, foolish person who has little understanding of the world, and that innately leads to his demise. Ursa, conversely, is more hesitant and more uncertain, and she loses a lot of her original personality that she had before she met Ozai, but she still retains her humanity. The search reveals that Ursa was kind of a theater dork. She loved plays, she loved acting, she loved the masks, and the blue spirit mask that Zuko uses in Avatar and that he cares so much for was one of Ursa's masks, and he fundamentally feels, not just on a literal physical sense, but on a more metaphorical thematic sense, a connection to his mom when he wears that mask. Ursa is a kind of character we don't really see a lot of otherwise in Avatar The Last Airbender. Arguably because she is the product, at least initially speaking, of a more carefree world. Neither Zuko nor Azula really take after her. Zuko is like her in that he's a good person, but he's also very serious and grave. He has a lot to deal with, far more so than he should have had to deal with at that age, and it affects him deeply. Azula is frenetic, wild, megalomaniacal. She has this desire for power and control, like her father. And so she affects this facade of complete certainty and order, but beneath that, she is this wild, writhing person who has no clear, consistent sense of self besides the value she derives from dominating others. There's that Hegelian dynamic again, and so she crumbles at the end of the show. Neither of them really resemble Ursa. Ursa is kind of a trickster. She's very mischievous. Of the main Avatar group, the person she resembles the most is probably Toph. It's not a perfect comparison, but there is this shared impish desire of the two of them to trick people for the sense of tricking it, because it's enjoyable, because it's pleasant and fun. The difference is that Toph has absolutely no sense of the dramatic. She has no artistic sense, no aesthetic sense whatsoever, whereas Ursa is very much an artist figure herself. She's very clever and witty and sharp, and she uses that to survive in the court of the Fire Nation when she's married to Ozai. The closest we see of that side of her is when the show is never this explicit about it, but when she kills Fire Lord Azulon, Ozai's father, as part of an agreement with Ozai to get him the throne and to spare Zuko's life. That is the closest we get to who Ursa actually organically is as a person. She's not mean, she's certainly not imperious like Ozai or Azula, but at the same time, she is a bit amoral, a bit mischievous. She loves playing with others for her amusement, because it's part of the grand carnival of life. She is a bit more upbeat than Toph, but she has that same wry amusement at the world. She's very much different from this sentimentalized mother figure that Zuko thinks of her as. But all those lively, effervescent, somewhat morally questionable qualities of her are just beaten out of her by her marriage to Ozai, which is one of forced obedience and submission. Her personality is basically drained away. And that's unfortunate. The person closest to her, certainly her child closest to her in personality, is Ki, who has a lot of the same playfulness as her mom, a lot of the same mischievousness, a lot of the same desire to do what's right, but in a bit of an unconventional or unexpected way. And we're left to wonder to what extent Zuko and Azula would have turned out differently had they grown up in a different environment. It is very fitting that neither of them, who grow up in this imperial center of the Fire Nation, at all resemble the behavior of their mom, which is a bit more devil-may-care, a bit more wildly mischievous and playful and daring. It's perhaps in her an emblem of this older culture of the Fire Nation that was suppressed by this singular monocultural conception of what it means to be a Fire Nation citizen, which is this devotion to absolute precision, order, mechanistic accuracy, and focus in all things. So it's a tragic and sad ending for Ursa. But she has the chance to move past that ending and to start anew. And it's a bit of rough going in the comics to truly decide who she wants to be. But at least she has an opportunity to make choices for herself and not be defined solely in relation to what happened to her. So anyway, thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can, and you want to see more videos like this before anyone else. Keep watching Avatar. It's a great show. It's always a good time to watch Avatar. Take care, everyone. Adios, comrades.